Hello, this is a recording of a Winchester Heritage Open Days event live streamed in 2020. We hope you enjoy it.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Bill Lucas. I'm Professor of Learning at the University of Winchester and a trustee alongside Chris Mulvey at the English Project. We're delighted to be working in partnership with Heritage Open Days and to be bringing you into our world for tonight's talk. The focus of tonight's talk is the English language in Hampshire and in Yorkshire. Just a few words about the English Project and then I'll introduce our speaker. The English Project is a national charity. We promote awareness and understanding of the unfolding global story of the English language in all of its varieties, past, present and future. We try to present ideas about English in an intelligent, entertaining, inclusive and where possible interactive way. Our big idea is the creation of the first ever museum for the English language here in Winchester, and we're making some real progress with that. Our annual idea is on the 13th of October, when we remember a significant event in Parliament and English for the first time beginning to be spoken in the mother of parliaments. On English Language Day, we hold some kind of event, and this year I'll tell you more about that, but it involves our patron, the very wonderful Professor David Crystal. From one wonderful speaker to another, let me now turn to introduce Christopher Mulvey is Emeritus Professor of English at the University of Winchester and a trustee of the English Project. He's a graduate of Magdalen College, Oxford. He received his PhD from Columbia University, and he is a prolific author. His articles are numerous, and his books include Anglo-American Landscapes, Transatlantic Manners, William Wells Brown's Clotel, and with yours truly, a history of the English language in 100 places. Will you all now, in whatever virtual way feels right, please, put your hands together and welcome Christopher Mulvey.
In the year 500, you would have heard, if you were in the land that we now call Hampshire, West Saxon being spoken. At the same time, in the year 500, if you were in the land that we now call Yorkshire, you would hear Northumbrian being spoken. And by the same token, if you were in the land that we now call Kent, you would have heard the language called Kentish being spoken. They're all versions of West Germanic, and they're all early versions of English that we call Old English. If you were looking for the forerunner of the English that I'm speaking now, Standard Modern English, you would have to go to the place that we now call Shropshire. And that's another story, and I'll pick it up. And Kent is rather fascinating. If we try to pursue the story of Kent, it sort of dies out. The Kentish language, Kent's lived here today. It dies out really in the period of the Middle English in the Middle Ages, and I'll come back onto that. If we think about the languages the versions of English being spoken in Hampshire and in Yorkshire, well, we might feel that they came out second best to the language spoken in Shropshire. Why that is the case is very, very interesting. But what exactly are we talking about when we talk about the English language in a county? Let's go back to Kent for a moment, because Kent is a county, the boundaries of which are pretty much unchanged for the last 1500 years, partly because they're set by the Thames to the north and by the Channel to the south, but there is a slightly less certain boundary to the west, which is the River Rother. So when I'm talking about a county, I'll need to talk about something more solid than the counties that have come and gone. They've been extended, they've been expanded, some counties have disappeared, and then some counties have reappeared. So what I'm going to talk about will be a county, the ceremonial counties of England. And of these, there are 48. The ceremonial counties are the historical counties, the They are counties that sort of uninterrupted by all the machinations of the 20th century movement of boundaries. They are, for those of you know about these things, they were cricket team counties. And as I say, there are 48. Now, each one of them has a story of the English language to tell, but the particularly good stories are those of Hampshire, Yorkshire, Staffordshire, and Kent. The English language was brought to us, as we know, from Bede by Jutes, Angles, and Saxons, and actually others as well, Frisians. All of these peoples coming across the Channel and the North Sea were speaking a language which we call West Germanic. They're all speaking versions of West Germanic. And it's interesting to note that all of these people arrived, and finally their versions of West Germanic were coalescing and separating out, but now are universally spoken in the 6,000 islands that make up the British Isles. But the West Germanic that they brought here to Britannia in about the year from 450 onwards, that has diverged from the West Germanics of the continental Europe, because that has developed into the languages of Dutch and German. So Dutch, German, and English are sort of coterminous, and in the year 500, they all would have been interchangeable. Those Anglo-Saxons and Jutes were very active, and by the year 550, they had created 7 kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. There was no good feeling between them, and they were all fighting each other all of the time. There were then many different dialects of West Germanic being spoken, but we can only really talk about 4 dialects, and those are the dialects that have survived in manuscripts: Northumbrian, Mercian, West Saxon, and Kentish. What happened to the other dialects is they're probably there, and they've evolved and they're developed into the speaking patterns of England today. Why do we have records from those of Northumbrian, Mercian, West Saxon, and Kentish? A reason for that is that as kings became wealthy, they tended then to become Christian. And when they became Christian, they got monks, and monks could write. And the first monks writing in English were the monks in the kingdom of Kent, and they were ordered by the kings of Kent to write in English, and so they wrote in Kentish. That was a pattern, so that this south of the Thames, the Kentish monks wrote in Kentish, the West Saxon monks wrote in West Saxon. North of the Thames and south of the Humber, the Mercian monks wrote in Mercian. North of the Humber and south of the Forth, the Northumbrian monks wrote in Northumbrian, and you can see how significant is the outlying of the division of the country by its great rivers, particularly the Thames, the Humber, and the Forth. During this period, there was a lot of interchange between the kingdoms of England, the heptarchy as it's called, but gradually one dialect of Old English became dominant, and that was the dialect of West Saxon, with its heartland in Hampshire, and it spread across England, propelled by an action of King Alfred the Great. He was very concerned about the education of his people, and he was concerned with their moral behavior, as well as being a great warrior and a great administrator. He was also something of a scholar. And so he ordered his monks, I don't know that he would have asked them, set his monks to translate 6 great texts of historical and religious significance. And these texts he had distributed to the bishops of his kingdom. These were such interesting texts, such as the Pastor Glorialis and many others, and the philosophy of Boethius, that monks from all over England became interested in these books and these texts, and they began to copy them. But as they moved out of West Saxon world and moved into Northumbrian and Kentish and Mercian areas, The monks, by and large, didn't bother, as it were, to translate from West Saxon into Mercian or from West Saxon into Northumbrian. They understood well enough each other's dialects. And as a result of that, West Saxon became, in a way, the first prestige dialect of the English language in the Anglo-Saxon times. That West Saxon flourished, and we can sort of give dates to that, from the death of King Alfred, and that was in 899, until the death of King Harold. We all know that date, 1066. English took a dip that day, and it was that day in which French began to become into the ascendant in this land. And for the next, well, until 1399, the kings of England were all French speakers. They didn't wish to speak English by and large, and they didn't bother to speak. I mean, we call them William, Richard, and Henry, but they called themselves Guillaume, Ricard, and Henri. And in that period of time, which is really from, as I say, 1066 until 1399, West Saxon evolved and developed. It stopped being a scholarly language. It didn't disappear altogether. And I hear it talking in manuscript because none of us can actually hear those people. But it did evolve to become West Country English. Now, what about Northumbrian English? Let's go to the north now. Let's cross the Thames. Let's go north and cross the Humber. And now we come to a land which is a great and powerful kingdom. And here, the English that they're starting out with, the West Germanic, I might call it, is Anglian. And that makes the first distinction between Hampshire West Saxon English and Yorkshire Anglian English. It starts out on a different basis, a different dialect. But then there was a huge impact on Anglian English. And Anglian English we can talk about in terms of it beginning now to divide into two dialects, Mercian and Northumbrian. But these were very wealthy kingdoms, and they were very much looked at by the people that some people call the Vikings, some people call them the Danes, some people call them the Northmen. They spoke a language which was Norse. We call it Norse. Technically, it's a version of Germanic. They were speaking North Germanic, and I was going to say we were speaking, but the people in Northumbria were speaking West Germanic. Again, they were languages which could intersect quite relatively easily, and we'll come to the significance of that. The Danes began to invade and steal and do all the awful things that they did, which actually Anglo-Saxons and Jutes had done in the 4th and 5th century. But it wasn't until in the middle of the 9th century the Danes not only invaded, they began to settle. And they first of all had to attack and subdue the kingdoms of Mercia and Northumbria. And then when they had done that, they turned their attention to Wessex. Then began a long struggle between the Saxons and the Danes. And it went on for 10 more years, 10 and painful years. We all know the story of burning of the cakes, which probably didn't happen, but it is something that everybody knows about King Alfred. But he was a wonderful man. I think he's probably the greatest of English kings. And King Alfred the Saxon fought to a kind of truce, to a draw, King Guthrum the Dane. The great prize for these to be fought for and what the Danes wanted was London. It was already a wonderful trading point, and you could make money and you could make wealth by holding on to London. It was a great object that King Alfred had to concede to the Danes. They were going to agree not to invade him if they were allowed to have London, but he did ask a big concession from them. He demanded that they became Christian. That doesn't seem a lot in exchange for London, but it was a pretty big thing to ask. The Danish kings were actually quite keen to become Christian because the world that was beginning to emerge, I don't want to use the word Dark Ages, actually it's quite a light period. There's lots of wonderful things happening. And there was a network of royal families, Austrian families, the families of Charlemagne, all the way from, and these families were already intermarrying, sharing brides and bridegrooms. The Danish kings were encouraged then, if they were to become Christian, to have a Christian wife. They tended by and large not to put away their Woden worshipping wife, and often had two wives, a Christ worshipping wife and a Woden worshipping wife, and would sort of march them out for the occasion. I'm not sure how seriously they took their religion, but that business of intermarriage was terribly significant. The area that Alfred conceded to the Danes and said he would not invade was the land north of the Thames, south now of the Tweed, beginning to see that border becoming to be what we would recognize now, not so much the Forth as the Tweed, and to the east of Watling Street, which runs sort of diagonally up England and in some respects can be called roughly the A5, not the A5 then. This was the land that Alfred conceded to the Danes. But since the Danes now were willing to become Christian, there was extensive intermarriage. This had been preventing the mixing of the Angles and the Danes. Now they intermarried, and what began to happen was a language began to emerge, which was a combination of Norse and Northumbrian. The same was also happening in Mercia. But the language in Northumbria was given the name in the 19th century, by 19th century scholars, of Dano-Anglian. Not a term we use anymore, but we can simply call it English. But to this language of Dano-Anglian, which really stretched down to the Thames, there was a barrier with the Thames, and there was no intermarriage with the Danes in the West Saxon kingdom. This had two results. What was happening up in Mercia and in Northumberland was that the children of these mixed marriages were learning Anglian and Norse words. In the English that I'm now speaking, which comes out of, I say, Mercia, standard English, we've got at least 900 words that we've taken from Norse. We might have another 900, but we're not sure whether they actually were already in Anglian and were there already. So it shows you how close the languages were. But if you go into the dialects of Yorkshire and the north, you will find thousands of Danish words, and that really makes a difference when you listen to somebody coming from the north and they're talking in a local rural dialect. They borrowed some quite remarkable words from the Norse, from the Danes. Words like leg and egg and husband. I'm pretty sure the Angles had legs and eggs and husbands before the Danes arrived, but those really commonplace words were borrowed. But the children also borrowed of shared words, took a word from mummy, took a word from daddy. So we've got a lot of doublets from the north. We've got kirk and church. We've got dike and ditch. We've got skirt and shirt. There are many of them. More profoundly, perhaps, these children took pronouns from Norse. And like they, them, and their. And even the word she is taken from Norse. Very unusual for one language to borrow pronouns from another. There's a good reason for it. There was a kind of homophonic effect. The pronouns in the Old English were becoming to sound so alike that it was quite helpful to take these words from the Norse, which were really quite distinctive. But that's another story. Now we have to move forward to the end of the 14th century, and where we have now what we now call Middle English. And we need to address ourselves again briefly to Mercian English, which had been influenced by Norse. And it was the English that was being spoken by the Kings Henry IV, King Henry V, and King Henry VI. So in a long reign, and I focus upon King Henry IV particularly, because he took the throne, as you may or may not remember, from Richard II in 1399. And he is the first English king to be a native speaker of English since the time of King Harold, who got the arrow in his eye. With those kings came courtiers and also clerks. And so the language of the court, which was now beginning to fix in London, and the language particularly of Chancery, became very much the language of this evolved version of East Mercian. We could call it, as I say, a courtly language in the 15th century. And then in the 16th century, it became a learned language, because with the arrival of printing, and within a sense, a falling away of Latin, the English language needed to be updated and improved. And we had already imported 20,000 words from French in the period of the French kings. We now imported another 20,000 words from Latin. So there's a great Latinization. You can pick this up, of course, in Shakespeare. But in the 17th century, the borrowing from Latin went a slight stage further. They began to borrow from the Latin grammar, these antiquarians, because they said the real pure grammar is Latin grammar. And that Latin grammar made a lot of changes. I'll pick it up when we can't start to talk about children in school. This refining, this correcting, this Latinizing of the English language, and it's really the Midlands dialect spoken in London, which we could almost call a Westminster dialect. This was much improved and much continued by the great dictionary makers of the 18th century. Dr. Johnson stands out, of course. Then in the 19th century, the schoolmasters picked it all up. And here we get a rather interesting development of Westminster dialect. It becomes the public school English. If you wanted to get a job in the schools, the fee-paying schools, you had to talk as they talked in Westminster. And you could pick that up either by getting it at home, which is pretty rare, or by just learning it and taking it on. How did this affect Hampshire and Yorkshire? Well, first of all, we must note that there were these public schools, and I have a word about why they're called public in a moment. There's Ampleforth College, and there was Harrogate Ladies' School in Yorkshire. In Hampshire, we had Winchester College and St Swithin's School for Girls, either founded long ago or founded in the 19th century. Now, the public school English that was being taught and spoken in these schools had had three quite distinct features. First of all, it was not regional. You couldn't locate it to any part of England, unless you were going to say you located it to the court, which is a doubtful way of putting it. It had a very distinct sound. In its exaggerated and strangulated form, you might find it to be a rather strange kind of English, sort of spoken by Virginia Woolf. It also had a very distinctive grammar. I talked about that Latinization of the grammar by the 17th century antiquarians, and they came up with these four rules which you might recognize. No double negatives, no double comparatives, no splitting of infinitives, and no ending sentences with prepositions. These actually go quite against the, you might say, the natural grain of English, which is a Germanic language, which rather likes double negatives originally and has you can't split infinitives in Latin because they're one word. But our infinitives are pretty strange: to do, to be, to so on and so forth. And up with which I will not put, you may remember, is Churchill's joke about not ending sentences with prepositions. But to be able to speak this kind of English was now becoming a mark of a status. Showed you had a rather expensive education. Let me look at two lads from Lancashire. I can say Lancashire. No. Let me look at two lads from Yorkshire. Michael Palin and Geoffrey Boycott. I think they might be both knighted now, I'm not sure. Now, Michael Palin, the Monty Python, the Python, he often talks in his travelogues about Sheffield, and he's a great fan of Sheffield United Football Club, and he's a great devoted son of the city of Sheffield. But you don't hear a trace of Yorkshire or Sheffield in his speaking. And that's because he went to school in a public school called Shrewsbury. Actually, in the town, they call it Shrewsbury. So you can see a class distinction there. We're moving to what's called a sociolect. Geoffrey Boycott, on the other hand, didn't quite have the opportunities of Michael Palin. He went to local schools, and then he took an exam, which I took, and many of you may have taken the 11 plus, and sadly he failed it. So he didn't go to a grammar school. He went to a secondary modern. Now, whenever you hear Geoffrey Boycott, he's very proud of his Yorkshire English. Yes, I mean, you wouldn't doubt that he came from Yorkshire, as you might be surprised to know that Michael Palin did. Geoffrey Boycott failed to get into a grammar school, and that was a good name for those schools. Let's look at why it was called a grammar school. They were called grammar schools. Well, once the grammar schools, which are the original schools like Eton or Winchester, or the great schools that they became called in the 19th century, the grammar they taught was Latin. You weren't even allowed to speak English. But in the 19th century, they began to change their sort of behavior patterns. They began to charge very big fees and then call themselves public schools. And then because the fees were so great, they were able to exclude the public. So that explains the mystery, really, of that strange name, public school, which is really a private school. But the cities and counties throughout England had increasingly need of an educated population, so they set up county and city grammar schools. Now let's look at the way these grammar schools would operate in Hampshire or in Yorkshire. What they focused on and what they were getting their children to write properly was written English. Now, I've used the word properly there right off. Correct English, proper English, difficult language, difficult wording. The written English that they want was all about forbidding double negatives, double comparatives, split infinitives, and those sentence endings. And at the same time as they were changing the children's writing, there was seemed to be an effect to some extent on their accent. Whereas in the public school, they wanted the children to adopt the accent of the Westminster, of the public school accent, and actually would punish you if you didn't. They weren't that interested in the schools throughout the counties of England in changing that vocalization. But once you start making a child write a proper English, they get an idea of its properness, and it begins to I was going to say infect, but I should probably say inform the English they're speaking. One of the great tests of proper English, with quotation marks, is the double negative. People who use a double negative are either deliberately saying I'm not an educated person, or they haven't had an advanced education. We have truly moved from a dialect to what we can call a sociolect, and for 90% of the populations of Hampshire and Yorkshire we're talking today, we can talk probably in terms of dialects and sociolects. But to talk about another group of people living in these counties, we need another term, and that term is ethnoelect. The ethnoelect is the speech of a particular ethnic group. And the ethnic groups which have influenced dialects or speaking of English in Hampshire and in Yorkshire are peoples who've come from Pakistan, from India, and from Bangladesh. And in Yorkshire, Bradford, Sheffield, Leeds, and Hull had substantial Asian populations. And there are 10 more towns in Yorkshire that have Asian communities. Hampshire slightly less so, but nonetheless, there are communities, Asian communities in Southampton, Portsmouth, and Basingstoke. We go up to the north again to Bradford. Well, fantastic. There are 100,000 persons of Pakistani origin in Bradford. That's 20% of the population. The older people might only be speaking Punjabi. The middle-aged people or whatever, they will probably be speaking Punjabi and English. They might be bilingual. Their children probably are not bilingual, but are speaking English, but an English fully informed, fully inflected by Punjabi. They have created then a new Northern English dialect, and this has really been since the Second World War, and really since the 1960s and 70s. Now let's look at Southampton and look at Hampshire. In Hampshire, we have two major communities, the British Indian community of 8,000 in Southampton, and a British Bangladesh community of 4,000 in Portsmouth. They're speaking actually distinct dialects. We might hear them as the same, but they're not the same. And the one coming to London to Portsmouth has come from London to Portsmouth. And it's a London Asian dialect. And the dialect spoken by the British Indian in Southampton has come from Birmingham. These small numbers might mean that these small ethnic groups might actually disappear. On the other hand, I want to just point out these ethnoelects, Asian ethnoelects, and I'm not talking about Chinese or because that's also a dialect to be heard, Pakistani, Bangladeshi and Indian are coming from possibly the largest English-speaking pool in the world. That is the 350 million people who speak the English language in what used to be called the subcontinent of India. Now, I've got to finish, and what I want to do to finish is to do something rather desperate. I want to try to vocalize the rural dialect of Hampshire and the rural dialect of Yorkshire. I'll probably do a little bit better with Hampshire because I've lived here for 40 years, but I did live for a year between Bradford and Leeds, and what a beautiful county it is. Now, to focus on this, my first sample comes from a great writer, but one who did not take West Country English seriously. My second sample comes from a minor writer, but one who took broad Yorkshire English very seriously. My great writer is William Shakespeare. When he arrived in London, in about 1580, Shakespeare would have spoken with an accent that probably was quite noticeable by Londoners, except that London is the great sort of pooling pot of the dialects of England. And London kept up its population for the next 200 or 300 years and increased it. But because though it's, I think, demographically negative, people poured in such greater numbers that though most people died, more people arrived to keep the place going. Shakespeare's speech would have been West Midland speech. He was on the, if you like, the right-hand side of the A5 of the left-hand side of Watling Street, and his Warwickshire English was much less affected by Norse than would have been Lincolnshire English. I don't know how did he adapt his English or not? I don't know. What's interesting is he used lots of different forms of English in writing his plays, and he did feel free to mock the speech of the people who came from below the Thames. That's West Country English. Maybe he mocked them because he found it funny, or maybe, like many people, he thought, before they laugh at my West Midland speech, I'll make jokes of West Country speech. He used it in a lot of plays. Famously, he uses it in King Lear. And he has a noble character, Edgar, who's disguised as a peasant, and he has him speak in West Country. It's not really West Country. We call it, I don't call it, but if I were an actor, the acting world calls it marmoset. And I quote here, an imitation West Country accent used by actors. And here's the noble Edgar speaking as a good gentleman, go your gait and let poor folk pass, and should have been swaggered out of my life. 'Twould not have hastened so long as been by fortnight. Nay, come not near the old man. Keep out, shoot for ye. I shall try whether your custard or my balbo be the harder. She'll be playing with you. Edgar's go your gait, meaning, go on your way, is actually a lapse into northern speech. Gate derives from Norse gather, but Shakespeare was not attempting to do a genuine representation of the lovely language of West Country Hampshire. He was no dialect poet. A man who was a dialect poet was John Castillo, a 19th century stonemason. Castillo wrote in broad Yorkshire, this I shall make an even worse pass at this when I come to speak it. The opening stanza that I'm going to read you is from a poem called Old Isaac or Old Isaac. And it shows what a rich language had developed from the ancient fusion of Norse and Anglian. Jan night, I went home from work. A la bit of fool, 'twas dark. Quick la and cheerful as a lark. And thought myself, I sat me down to rest a bit atop a hill. Folks just were turning out their kite. A little plain old man come by. Come ye and sit ye down, good friend, says I, and rest your legs. He'd been a bit of flour to buy, and three eggs. My apologies to the ancient inhabitants of Hampshire and Yorkshire for not doing justice to their wonderful speech. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. That was a barnstorming performance of two of our wonderful patterns of speech. I'm sure you'll get the call from the BBC very soon to share them. Now, I'm a little worried that there are no questions coming in to you yet, but don't worry. I've thought of that, and I have a few for myself. But just let me remind anybody, please use the Q&A function now to either make a comment or ask a question, and I can then relay that to Chris. But let me just start off my mic with a question of my own, Chris. You talked a lot about the sudden ways in which conquest changes the way we speak, and then you moved on to sort of intermarriage and the ways in which people from other parts of the world or the other parts of the country began to change patterns of speech. And I wonder whether there was any way in which you could describe, I mean, how many numbers does it take, as it were, to influence a language? You talked about you talked about British Indian and British Bangladeshi in Hampshire, for example. How many do you need to reach a kind of tipping point when you start to notice change?
Well, I think it's not just a matter of numbers, it's a matter of who these people are. There's a great debate, and the language which is quite significant here is Brittonic. What happened to Brittonic? I talked about Kentish. It didn't really disappear. I expect the people in Kent are still talking a form of Kentish, or probably somewhat overwhelmed actually by West Saxon and then London English. But Brittonic was a language which was spoken right the way through the territory, which was invaded by those Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. And it disappeared almost completely. We used to think, and we were told at school, that the Brittonic peoples who lived here were driven, as it were, to Cornwall and driven into Wales and driven up. But that doesn't seem now to be the case. And DNA is suggesting that they didn't actually. There's an intermarriage took place. But often, when we talked about intermarriage with the Norse and the Angles, there was actually a fusion, but that doesn't always happen. What did happen, and we're not entirely sure why, was that Brittonic disappeared. What, again, the French invaded us, the Norman French. English, as I say, took a great dip, but it actually reappeared in 300 years. The Normans arrived and they took over and they dominated, but there's only, they say, 5% of the population was Norman. It had a huge effect on English history, had a huge effect on English language, but it was only a very few people. The Normans, by the way, had just learned French in 2 generations because they were speaking Northern Germanic. So it just is astonishing, and it's to do with powers of numbers, but also authority, and then all sorts of many different patterns.
Thank you. I've got a very topical question here about the current Education Secretary, I don't know if the speech of Gavin Williamson is one that you have analysed or not, but just the question is whether or not his accent has any significance. I'm imagining in the Yorkshire sense.
I forget. I regret to say I can't remember anything he's said last. And I can't. Yes, I think he has. If I might talk about another minister of the Crown, who was George Osborne, for a brief second. George Osborne, and we often have in our cabinets people who are speaking this. It's not just received pronunciation public school, but sometimes called upper received pronunciation. That rather toffee-nosed voice that you sometimes hear with Boris Johnson or even David Cameron. George Osborne, when he became Chancellor, had he went to St Paul's School, had a very upper class voice, but he was told that he suffered of what was called irritable vowel syndrome. It upset people to hear him talking, and so to some extent he modified his accent. He didn't go Cockney. So I'm sorry about, what's his name, Williamson, was it?
Gavin Williamson, who I think went to university in Bradford, and that may be part of the questioner's thinking, but has a sort of curious amalgam of an accent. But that's a very nice to have the Mockney point. There are a couple of questions just jumping around now, Chris, about Shropshire English, and I'm just going to read them to you. First of all, there's a lovely thank you, fantastic speech. You said early on that Shropshire English was closest to what we speak today, and then didn't mention it again. Was it specifically Shropshire, or were you referring to Mercian in general? And then there's another question about how the Shropshire dialect became predominant.
Right. Well, I didn't say too much about Shropshire because I had to talk about Hampshire and Yorkshire, and next year I want to talk a great deal about Shropshire. But I would really want to be talking more about Staffordshire. Staffordshire is the dialect of Mercian. I say we take Staffordshire because that's where there was obviously an immensely powerful court with immense wealth, which really, when they came across the Staffordshire hoard, they found we hadn't realized how wealthy that kingdom was, and the jewelry and the minerals had come from all over Europe. Now, in that part of the world, you would have had Mercian spoken, and I wanted to talk somewhat about that because it's a refined, Latinized and corrected version of that English, which has become standard modern English. The Shropshire I need to think about a lot more. The Shropshire English would be a version somewhat like Shakespeare's English, which would be a Mercian, which was much less affected by Norse. The thing about Norse is that all those words I use, like he, she, and it, I mean, we're all using them. So, it doesn't seem surprising, but it is in a way surprising that that's the. Is it surprising that it's a dialect? That's a matter of politics.
Thank you.
West Saxon couldn't last because it was not London English, and London English was going to dominate in one way or another. A lot of English is in London, though.
Thank you. You'll be pleased to know that we've got listeners and watchers from all over the world, and this is a question from Rebecca from the United States, who just wonders whether you could give an example of public school speech.
Oh, really? Yes. I'll try. Bill, you
can either act it out or just give us some examples of words and language. And we have a very curious language here in Winchester College, for example.
Yeah, we do. I mean, if you went to the, I give the example of the word pint. My grandfather was a Cockney, and he would say, "I'm going to pint my door green." But if you moved along to the middle of the middle of London, and you got into the sort of West End, you got middle-class people, they would say, "Would you like a pint of beer?" But if you got as far as Buckingham Palace and would talk to the Queen, she would say, "I don't get your pint. What kind of pint are you trying to make? Get out of my house." And so this would be the talk, really. Actually, you've only got to listen to Boris Johnson, particularly when he starts to really rave, because when we rave, we go back to our roots. And I think that Johnson, presumably, I suspect, didn't learn his upper class English at Eton, but is a sort of homebred. So that might be the point. By the way, since we got somebody from the West, from America, what happened to West Country English? It did have a tremendous boost because it poured out of England with the opening up of North America. And by 1700, there were 200,000 West Country speakers in the Chesapeake Bay area, and that has become the basis of American Southern English.
Thank you very much. I love your answers. Your answers to questions that weren't even asked. That's wonderful. You've got some of your watchers are choosing to identify themselves by their location, and this is Margaret from York. Can you say a bit more about why pronouns were not often adopted into another language? She goes on to say pronouns can increase clarity. For example, no, he, she in Finnish, which is confusing.
Yes. Well, basically, you've got in terms of borrowing words, you've got two classes of words in the lexicon. One is called the closed class, and the other is called the open class. But basically, the closed class would be pronouns, prepositions, and some verbs. I mean, like the verb to be. These are the basic sort of scaffolding words of the language, and pronouns are very much in that capacity. So but on the other hand, nouns and adjectives and verbs and adverbs, these are very easily shared and borrowed. I mean, as soon as you go to a country and you say, what's that word? And they say it's bamboo, you borrow the word bamboo. But you'd be very unlikely to borrow their pronoun for he, she, and it. So these are words which are so embedded in the language that it is a remarkable thing, and it reflects actually a phonetic overlap with the English Anglo-Saxon pronouns that came to sound so alike that they broke out and took over these Norse ones.
So the dialogue with Rebecca is continuing, and Rebecca wants to know whether Sir David Attenborough uses public school speech.
Very much so. Would you be upper, Bill, or would you just call it? I mean, he talks.
Well, I think it's very much a BBC received pronunciation, and I think he's. If you compare his speech to, say, Boris Johnson or even George Osborne, it's moved a little into the centre, a bit like, say, the Queen's has over the years, if that's fair.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that he certainly has a public school voice, because it began to be called BBC English, and now we just, because those are rather almost offensive words, it's called received pronunciation, and that seemed to be offensive. Okay. And so you might just call it toff talk.
We're back into Hampshire now, and there's a question about the origin of the distinct, and I won't be able to say it very well, but the distinct Hampshire oo sound, as in house or hoose, and the tendency to shift the H, as in Internampner. Could you say anything about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, these are really characteristics of West Saxon English. And I think, you see, if the Normans hadn't got here, my favourite thought is that we would be, the speech of the court would be based on West Saxon, modified and developed. But then the Queen would say on Christmas Day, I wish you a merry, merry Christmas. My husband and I wish you a merry Christmas. And that would be the elegant way of talking. The thing about the West Country talk, it's a beautiful way of speaking, but it wasn't spoken by the ruling class. Did I mention the fact that you need an army to have a language rather than a dialect? And the British Army made sure, as I said earlier, that the English language is understood right across the British Isles. And actually, at one point, by 1801, it was a single, complete United Kingdom. By 1922, Southern Ireland or Eire had withdrawn. But in Ireland, English is their dominant language, even though my great uncle was a fluent Celtic speaker. But he also spoke English.
Sort of a bit of a theme here about power, in a sense, but now the power of law. a question about whether legal texts or codes were during Anglo-Saxon times, would they have been written in the local language, or what language would they have been written in, or would they be the four great areas that you were talking about? What would that look like?
Right. Well, a great amount of legal documentation would have been done in Latin. I mean, the monks themselves would probably. It's quite interesting. They were ordered to write in English, and they would probably scribble in English. But I mean, they were trained to write Latin because Latin was the language of the Western Church. So a great amount of documentation would have been in Latin, but that's not that helpful when most of the population doesn't speak Latin. So it was the Kentish king who actually got Augustine to write his laws out in the year 601 in the English language, the Kentish language. Those monks found there were certain sounds that they didn't have letters for. The th sound just doesn't occur in Latin. And so you got the th created, which has what is it, a thorn and a whin, isn't it? So they created 3 or 4 letters, which if we had kept them, and then the French hadn't come along and really, we had a word like queen, beautifully spelt in Old English as C-W-E-N, absolutely phonetic, isomorphically fit. But English spelling just went haywire, and we lost a lot of those rather good invented letters by those Kentish monks. Can I answer that? Answer
very well. We've got a question from Michael, which sort of relates to this. Again, many thanks for this. Given that we still have strong regional accents and dialects, would it be true to say that the invention of printing was more influential in standardizing written English as opposed to spoken English?
I think that would be fair up to a point.
I mean, spelling particularly.
Yeah, I mean, it's the arrival of printing, which was in England, what, 1456 or whenever, just in time to miss just before the great vowel shift. So that's another reason we had such appalling spelling of the English language. But that of course, that was what led to make this courtly language, the language of London and the Chancery Court. What with printing, it then spread right through England, and nothing could match it at all. So that a poet like that I was quoting at the end there, his name I've forgotten, Costello, for him to publish a book in broad Yorkshire was a very wonderful thing, but also idiosyncratic. I don't know that the question is, how much did it modify spoken English? Very interesting point. It probably pushed people towards homogenizing their grammar, but not necessarily their accents.
Yeah. Okay.
You could get us. Yeah.
Question now, really interesting one from somebody who's from Hampshire originally and now based in Yorkshire, and have been mistaken from being born in Yorkshire before. So the question is, what do you think the biggest similarities between the dialects are?
Well, I think the biggest similarity is probably, and it's interesting, the problem that person has sort of illustrated, is probably that it doesn't sound like standard English. And that is a sort of game that Shakespeare was playing. What you notice, I mean, when you hear a person, I lived in America for 15 years, and people, when I say New York City, where I live, I always say New York City. And that just for one phoneme, we're so sensitive to people, the way people speak. We listen with automatically with astonishing accuracy. David Crystal argues that it was an evolutionary thing. When your men came back and you were huddled in the cave with your children, they would start shouting, and you'd hear their voices. You know it was them, and you'd come out. But if you heard another accent, you needed to be really acute. And we are very, very sensitive to accents, and they are extremely socially, it can be very disruptive. In the American, you have about 5 standard accents. a Bostonian accent that Kennedy spoke, and then you have the wonderful accent of Henry Fonda, which is probably the one that the Chinese are going to adopt for the studying system of English. And then you've got a southern and then a coastal accent, and all of these are quite equal in status. Whereas in English, to some extent, we have a single dominant accent, except that a man like Terry Wogan, God rest his soul, he's Irish, he went to an Irish public school, and so he has a very elegant Irish. Same is true of Miss Brodie. The Edinburgh voice is a very elegant one, and it's not the same as the Etonian voice. The Welsh never did seem to get one of those fancy voices, but our Welsh
maybe they had the wrong kind of school. Who knows? A question from Alan. Again, a nice, well done to you. Brilliant talk. The differences between Hampshire and Yorkshire are partly language and dialect and partly pronunciation. Can we trace both of those elements back to those Anglo-Saxon roots?
Yes, I think we can, because when we're talking about a dialect, we are talking in terms of the phonetics. That's English has basic, all Englishes apparently have, I think it's about 46 phonemes. And all the different versions of English use those phonemes, but they use them in different positions, like pint, pint, and pint.
Just say for a moment, just tell people what a phoneme is, would you, just in case that's not a term they're familiar with?
A phoneme is the minimum piece, the minimum sound unit which changes the meaning. So bit, bat, and bot, you can hear that with a single letter, and a letter is technically called a grapheme, the smallest written sign which changes a meaning.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay. So you have a phonetical, you have a way of saying, we call it the accent, but it's it's a phonetic distribution. Then you have grammar, and grammar is addressed by linguists in two different ways. You have what's called the shape of the words, morphology. So if I say I am, thou art, he is, you are, you will see that the word changes all the time. That's called the morphology of the word. And then you have the word order. If you say in English, the man bit the dog, it's profoundly different from saying the dog bit the man. But in Latin, it doesn't, because they are using a different morphology, they could put the words in whatever order they wanted, and then they would use it as Virgil does, very much for emphasis. So those four elements define the difference between a dialect, whereas an accent will just be a different way of sounding, but would have an identical grammar. That's why the grammar of English might become universalized with different accents.
Thank you.
So
we're moving from Wessex up to Yorkshire again, and a question from Cleo. Much of the Yorkshire of my childhood wouldn't be understood now. So thank you for mentioning my old school, by the way. Are we losing our old dialects?
Well, there's a great debate about this. The thing about language is that it's always drifting. Children don't say exactly like their parents. And phoneticians who go, I mean, I was reading about a man who was studying the African language called Twi, and he went back to England, and he was a brilliant sort of phonetician. But when he came back 30 years later, he found there's all these slight changes had taken place. So there's always this drift going on. And then you can also get that sort of energized by people who want to change their accent and make different accents. So the thing is that the argument is that no, we're not losing the accents, but they're all changing. A little bit like I have to say though, when I came to Winchester 40 years ago, the people who worked in the university, which was then the college, they often really had genuine sort of Hampshire accent. One used to say, "I like you, Chris, and my wife, she loves cream buns. I likes a cream bun myself."
Very nice. I better stop you there before you go too far down the self-disclosure road there. Although interesting as it would be, there's a question. I'm just putting a number of questions together, which are really, I suppose it's aimed at the English project. are we or who is documenting and recording the distinctive accents from or dialects from Hampshire and Yorkshire, for example, of the kind that you've been referring to?
Oh, very much. I mean, there's a wonderful project, the English Dialect Project. It's being done in many different universities and actually being done in continental Europe. The Germans and Austrians are very good at this, and they're absolutely absorbed with English. But I suppose the main project is that run by Jonathan Robertson at the British Library, and the British accent. I mean, Jonathan tells me that there are 700 different accents in the British Isles. The count of dialects, on the other hand, is supposed to be around about 37 to 40. So you can see you have many. Those are all being registered. I mean, now, since I suppose about 1890, we've actually been able to hear how people speak. You've got records of even Alfred Tennyson, I think. Now we've got massively documented, and we'll never be without. We'll never have to say, how did they speak in Kent? We'll know forever.
Very good. Now, here's a question that won't surprise you. We get it when we're on stages often in the English project, and it's a grammar question, just to give you some thinking time. What does Chris think of the changes in present-day grammar usage? It appears a whole generation were not taught grammar at school. Today, usages such as "me and John went home," etc., etc. What do you think about that, Chris?
Well, I have two thoughts. I probably have many more than two thoughts. One is it doesn't really matter. The thing about language is it's not fundamentally, it's not cultural, it's biological. And every child learns to speak the language of its mother and father with the rarest exceptions. And when you have an exception, that's because the child is severely mentally damaged. Otherwise, but I spent years trying to learn French, and I never did learn it, but I got English from mum and dad. So there is a real capacity to learn it and to focus on language. And what was the question going to be, Bill? I've forgotten it now.
Do you know, I think I'm forgetting the question myself. And it was about grammar, really. It was a question about whether or not you have a value position on that, or whether the English project does.
I always say, I think the English project says that all accents and all dialects are created equal, and we love them all, and we're going to collect them all. If you want to get a job at the BBC, you better talk the kind of language they want you to talk. I wanted to, when I'm giving a lecture of this kind, I think I use received standard grammar, and I don't not use no double negatives, and I get more better speech all the time. You know, so and we can also move in and out. It's a huge issue with the Daily Telegraph and Radio 4, this about correct English. But who's correct? I mean, basically, we saw it emerging from almost anywhere. And because they were so powerful, they said our English is correct. And if you don't like it, we'll beat you. And people who were beaten because they didn't get their double negatives right are very, very stern about other people who, make the same mistake.
Very good. Now here's a very specialist question, so no problem. It's not a particular area of your expertise, although your expertise is huge, and it refers to a particular book. And forgive me if I get her name wrong. It's from Mark, and the book is by Susan Ersthuizen. And it's written in 219, arguing for a minimal movement of people across the North Sea, and thus a radically different account of the early development of English, which is kind of you gave, I think, the standard view of how that happened.
Yes, I mean, the great question is, did 200,000 people come across, or was it about 5,000? Was it simply what you might call a warrior invasion? And in which case, which is rather like the Norman invasion, where you have just 5% of the population dominating, and that actually is a pretty standard number. 5%. Look at Assad, Syria. 5% of minority can very easily dominate as long as they have the coherence and the money and the power. So the great question is, did they come in large numbers, and was it a real settler migration, or was it simply a warrior invasion? DNA is beginning to suggest that certainly there were far fewer than we thought. and we might have to fall back on the idea that you had a kind of, basically it would be talking a male invasion, and they took over. And then two things would happen. They would take the women, but they would also, if they were strong enough, force everybody else to talk their language. The French didn't do that. That is to say, the Angevins, the Plantagenets, but the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes did do that, because they didn't kill all those Britannics. They didn't drive them into Wales. They absorbed them. And so it's the smaller absorbing the greater. I don't know what the real figures are. DNA, I hope, will tell us.
Thank you. Erudite as ever. We've just got time for a couple more questions, and then we're going to round this up. And here's one really for us, for both of us. Is the English project geographically constrained or fully international? The way English is spoken in parts of Asia can be inaccessible to native Brits. And this is a perfect, just whilst you're thinking of your answer, a perfect and outrageous opportunity to plug a fine book that we wrote together called A History of the English Language in 100 Places, available from all good online booksellers. Chris.
The English project is about every kind of English. It's about the English language as it's spoken by the English speaker. And all forms of English are equal. We absolutely adore Indian English. I've been given a talk in Delhi, and they said to me, what kind of English should we speak? Should we speak Indian? Should we speak American English, or should we speak British English? I said, you ought to produce your own dictionary like the Americans did in 1829 and have Indian and make that. There's a wonderful English language in India. Actually, it's very varied too, but always we got street language, and we've got written language, or we might say intellectual language. All forms of English are really not that difficult. You know, when I go to Barbados, there's three kinds of English being spoken: my kind of English, then educated West Indian English, and then Bayesian English. And I cannot understand Bayesian English, but I reckon if I stayed there a month and they let me hear them, because they won't let you hear them, I would pick it up. It's the same phonemes. You can roughly hear it. It's not like learning French. I know I couldn't learn French in a month, but I could learn Bayesian, I reckon. I could also learn Glaswegian in 2 weeks.
Very good. Well, there's a promise. Chris, just last question from me. You started by reminding us that there were 48 counties, and you kind of defined them by the presence or absence of a cricket team. And you've scattered your talk with references to a number of counties, and I think you said, and I just want to check that you did, that you might be wanting to come back on another occasion and talk to us about other counties and their Englishes. Do you want to just take an opportunity to say what that might be?
Yeah, well, I would like now to focus now a real attention on Staffordshire, and actually that group of because actually these dialects obviously don't locate right within a boundary of that kind. But I want to talk about Staffordshire, and then I really do want to address the language of Kentish. This has to be a separate issue. By the way, there are 72 counties in the British Isles, not the British Isles, in the United Kingdom. And so we could easily extend this into Wales and into Scotland and Northern Ireland, and they're fascinating accounts there. But I really, because I studied at Oxford, Mercia and Northumberland, what else was it? West Saxon and a bit of Kentish, and those strike me as being the hinterland of the four great dialects. Great only because we know them, and if we don't know them, we can't call it great.
Chris, I want to close now, and most importantly, thank you so much. And I'm sure all over the world, those who are watching will be clapping their hands now, and depending on the time of day, reaching for a beverage or whatever it is that they reach for. It's been absolutely wonderful having you talking to us, but also, if I may say so as a friend, brilliant in the interaction and the questions and answers at the end. So thank you very, very much indeed.
Most welcome.
I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't just say a little reminder to you. Well, first of all, thank you to our partners in Heritage Open Days. There are lots of these talks going on, so have a look on their website and on the Hampshire Chronicle website for those, and go and take part in them. on the 13th of October in the evening, we have David Crystal talking to us about the impact of COVID on the language that we all love. And I think that should be absolutely fascinating. It'll be very real. It'll be much more than lockdown and self-isolation and quarantine and new normal, but I'm sure those may play a part. It's a fundraising evening for the English project and will cost you the princely sum of £5.50. But if you've ever had a chance to hear David Crystal, I hope you'll feel that it's a very worthwhile use of your money. Christopher is waving at me. That may mean he wishes to say something.
I do wish to say something. I wanted to thank Fiona Grieg, the librarian at the University of Winchester, and thank the University of Winchester for allowing us to use this link, which has been, I think it worked well, but I don't know whether anybody could hear me. But I want to thank Fiona.
Thank you. And thank you, Ellie. And I think we're now at that stage where we say thank you, everybody, for listening. This has been recorded, and I'm sure we can get the link to you and your friends if you've not managed to see it, and indeed put it up on our website. So do go and search for the English Project website if you want to register for David Crystal's talk, and that's quite enough advertorial. Thank you very much, and it's good night from him, and it's good night from me.